PC part prices in 2023 are absolutely horrendous. Like, what are these prices and what is going on? Everything's so expensive and no one's buying any of this stuff. And that is why gaming PCs like this Ryzen 5 2600 and GTX 1080 PC are so important in today's climate, as I think these provide such a great value. Let me know if you like these budget PC videos, because I do like building budget PCs to flip, so let me know if you want me to make more of these videos. Shopping on the used market for most hardware components is definitely the way to go in 2023, in my opinion. Not a lot of people are comfortable with that, and that's totally fine, but if you're willing to take a bit of a risk, you can find great used deals on components like graphics cards and CPUs. Starting off with the CPU, and it is the Ryzen 5 2600. This Zen Plus CPU has 6 cores and 12 threads, and it clocks around 3.9 GHz. It's a decent CPU, especially when paired to our GTX 1080, and it should game just fine at 1080p and 1440p too. Maybe if you upgrade the CPU to something like a Ryzen 5 3600, you might be getting slightly more frames at 1080p, but you're spending more money at that point, so you've got to evaluate whether spending the extra money is worth the extra performance for you. This year, the GTX 1080 is 7 years old, and I did test it separately in a video which you can find up here, but it is still a monster of a GPU, especially at 1080p. This thing has got plenty of life left in it, especially if you don't care about ray tracing. Even at 1440p, the GTX 1080 is still a pretty decent card. 16GB of RAM is all that gamers need here in 2023, and I went with a 16GB kit of 3200MHz CL16 XPG memory, and I picked this up brand new for £38, which is an incredible deal. I think I paid for used RAM and it was the same price not too long ago, so yeah, not a bad deal at all. And I learned from my mistake of the first build I did a few weeks ago, and I went with an NVMe SSD. In here I've put a Kioxia 1TB NVMe SSD. It's a Gen 3 NVMe SSD, and it runs at speeds of 2100 megabytes per second read and write, so it's relatively fast, and it's about 4 times as fast as a SATA drive, so yeah, not bad. Not only have I built it, I've also benchmarked it. This is good for content for you guys because you can see how this PC performs, and it's also good for stress testing it before I sell it. I have more confidence in the PCs that I build when I stress test them to make sure they're working optimally and there's no issues like thermal throttling or any weird issues going on like that, so yeah. Starting off with benchmarking the Ryzen 5 2600X, and I've started with Cinebench here. For the single core, it got 996, which is just shy of that 1000, but this isn't anything to shy at all. And in the multi-core performance test, it got 6610, so the 2600 is a decent budget CPU, especially for around £50 on the used market. This is some pretty good value. Moving into the games now, and first up is F1 22, and on the very high preset, the GTX 1080 got 82 FPS on average, with 56 FPS for the 1% low. It looks very good on the high preset, and there's some great performance here too. I would recommend by dropping it to maybe the medium if you want to get a 144Hz experience, but other than that, if you've just got a 60Hz panel, the very high preset here looks very fine and it will be performing great on your system. Cyberpunk 2077 is up next, and this is always that one game that brings any PC to its knees. And I've tried out the medium preset here, and I also kept the textures on high because the 8GB of video memory on the 1080 is way more than enough for this game. This got 58 FPS on average with 48 FPS for the 1% low. Not bad performance here at all. Cyberpunk looks pretty good even at lower settings. Some of the reflections do look pretty trash on this preset, I'm not going to lie. But as long as you keep them textures high, most games will be looking pretty decent, I'm not going to lie to you. God of War is up next, and for once I set it to the high preset here, and I'm glad I did, with 71 FPS on average, with 48 FPS for the 1% low. It looks great here on the high preset, and you could definitely get away with ultra textures too, as 8GB of video memory is pretty overkill for 1080p, unless you're playing Hogwarts Legacy, but that's another story for another day. Modern Warfare 2 is up next, and I like to test this one as it's an insanely popular game, and it performs pretty well on modest hardware too. Here I set it to the balance preset, but I kept them textures on high. This makes the game look a lot less muddy because the low textures on this game look absolutely horrendous. But this got 89 FPS on average with 54 FPS for the 1% low. I would recommend, if you're looking for a competitive experience, to lower the settings to the basic preset, keeping the textures on high, and maybe upping the shaders to high as well, because that makes the camos look a lot better. And you'll be having a great gaming experience here on Modern Warfare 2, whether you're playing Warzone or multiplayer. Fortnite is that one game I like to test at both high and low settings, because a lot of gamers like me like to just play the game on high. We don't really care about sweating it too much. And then you get the very professional players who like as many frames as possible. Starting off with the high setting, that DirectX 11, it got 120 FPS on average with 50 FPS for the 1% low. Really good performance here, to be fair. I was pleasantly surprised. Caching, as always, will improve. That's what's causing the poor 1% low performance. So as you rack up the hours in the game, it will get a lot smoother. Switching to the low preset results in a modest performance boost, as we would imagine. This bumped both the average and the 1% lows up to 184 FPS and 92 FPS respectively. Scaling here wasn't as good as what I thought it was. It was pretty CPU bound in Fortnite here, so an upgrade to maybe a Ryzen 5 3600 or a 5600 perhaps would net more frames here, certainly. At £400 cost to build, this is some incredible performance and incredible value at 1080p, in my opinion. You could probably even get away with 1440p on this configuration too. I know when I tested the GTX 1080 alone, 1440p was easily doable. Maybe even 4K if you're playing lighter games, but that's not something I'd recommend if I'm honest. But if you want to play at 1080p or even 1440p, this configuration has got you covered. Another thing to note is, if you want to play at 1440p, you will be more GPU bound. In some games, I think Fortnite was a big outlier for this, were pretty CPU bound. On the low settings, Fortnite ran okay, but the GPU wasn't being fully utilised. If you bumped up to 1440p, yeah, you'd be losing a few frames, but you'd be more GPU bound and you'd be getting more out of your hardware, if that makes sense. But at 1080p, the GTX 1080 definitely has more to give, so if you were to pair this with something like a Ryzen 5 3600, or maybe even a Ryzen 5 5600, you'd be getting a few more frames, especially at 1080p, but that is down to you to evaluate though, as you've got to spend the extra money on a better CPU, so you've got to ultimately decide whether it's worth it for you or not. So judging from the data that I've gathered, one thing I would definitely change if you had the spare cash lying around is definitely upgrading the CPU. The Ryzen 5 2600 is by no means a bad CPU, but Zen Plus is nowhere near as good as Zen 2 or even Zen 3, so yeah. But I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world, as all the games that were CPU bound were running at more than 140 FPS anyway. So if you've got a 1080p 144Hz panel, which is pretty optimum for a setup like this, I don't think it's that much of a problem. Also, one annoying thing about this PC is it doesn't have the IO shield. When I bought the motherboard used on eBay, it didn't come with the IO shield, and this is an annoying thing about eBay, is a lot of people seem to lose their IO shields for their motherboards when they sell them used for whatever reason. I don't know what that's about, but yeah, it doesn't affect the performance in any shape or form. It just kind of affects the overall aesthetic of the build, I guess, and the professional look, I guess. So is building a budget PC in 2023 with similar specs worth it? I would say yes. If you're trying to get your foot in the door of PC gaming, I'd say a build like this is absolutely incredible, and 5 years ago I would have worked so hard for a PC like this, because this was way better than the PC I had 5 years ago. Admittedly, it would have been a lot more expensive back then, but these specs at this price, as if you can't tell already, is just pretty incredible in my opinion. And the truth is, not everyone has the money to buy a 13900K RTX 4090 system. The most popular graphics card in the world right now is a GTX 1650, and the GTX 1080 would wipe the floor with that any day of the week. And you can buy one of them brand new for around the same price as you can buy a used GTX 1080. Admittedly, the 1080 does use a lot more power, so you will have to invest in your power supply, but the gaming performance is certainly a lot better. So with that being said, I'm going to leave the video here. Leave a like on this one if you liked it, and let me know whether you want to see me make more budget PC content, because I actually quite like making this type of video. So yeah, and stay subscribed for more tech content because I've got so much on the way, and I'll catch you in the next one.